The smell hit town first. Thick chemical wrong. It rolled in low across the flat Kansas plain just after sunset on a Saturday in July 1971. Carried on a hot wind that had been blowing steady all day out of the southwest. Most folks in Collier Springs were at the grain cooperative picnic that evening. Tables set up behind the co-op building where the gravel lot met the railroad siding. Paper plates sagging with brisket and coleslaw. Kids running circles around the flatbed trailer someone had dragged out for a makeshift stage. The smell came in over the laughter and the tinny sound of someone's transistor radio playing Johnny Cash, and it made people lift their heads like cattle before a storm. By the time anyone thought to look toward the horizon, the smoke was already visible, a dark smudge spreading against the dimming sky. Maybe 3 miles out, maybe less, coming from the direction of the old Kemper place where the county had been letting that Chicago outfit store drums of something or other since spring. Nobody knew exactly what, because nobody had asked the right questions when the money came through. Let me tell you something about small towns in the early 70s. Information moves slow, decisions move slower, and by the time people figure out they should have been worried, it was usually too late. Collier Springs was no different. Population 342 if you counted the Methodists and the Baptists together, which most people did except during election years. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business but pretended they didn't, where a man's worth was measured in acres and handshakes, and where being different, being odd, being stubborn, being the one who wouldn't go along, could mark you for life. Which brings us to Everett Walsh. Everett farmed 220 acres on the north edge of town, land his grandfather had proved up in 1889. Good wheat ground when the rain came and hard-pan misery when it didn't. He was 53 that summer, lean as a fence post, with hands like cracked leather and a face that seemed permanently squinted against sun he'd been staring into since he was old enough to walk behind a plow. Everett had a reputation. Not a bad one, exactly, but the kind that made people smile and shake their heads when his name came up. He was the last man in Sumner County still running a 1948 John Deere Model A, that old two-cylinder green machine with the flywheel start and the putt-putt exhaust note that sounded like a giant heartbeat echoing across empty fields. Everyone else had moved on, newer tractors, more horsepower, hydraulics, diesel engines, roll bars, the whole modern package. But not Everett. He'd rebuilt that model 3 times over the years, knew every bearing and gasket by feel, could diagnose a problem by sound alone, and he told anyone who'd listen that the machine would outlast every fancy new rig in the county if a man took care of it proper. The town thought it was funny. Not mean funny, not at first, more like the gentle ribbing you give a cousin who still wore his high school leather jacket at 30. At the feed store, men would grin and ask Everett if his museum piece had made it through another season. At the diner, waitresses would joke about hearing him coming from 2 miles off, that distinctive pop, pop, pop that announced him like a parade. Even the younger farmers, the ones with new international harvesters and shiny Massey Fergusons financed through the bank, would pat Everett on the shoulder and tell him there was no shame in joining the modern world. Everett never rose to it. He'd just nod, pay for his coffee, and head back to his place, where that old John Deere sat in the barn like a relic from another age. But here's the thing about Everett that most people have forgotten or never knew. He'd been a volunteer firefighter for 26 years. Back when the county had actual money for such things back in the 50s, he'd trained with the state boys, learn how to read a fire, how to cut a line, how to think 3 steps ahead when everything was burning and most men were just reacting. He quit the volunteer company in '68 after some political nonsense with a new fire chief, a banker's son from Wichita who'd moved to town, and decided he knew better than men who'd been fighting grass fires since before he was born. Everett had walked away quiet, no speeches, no drama, just stopped showing up. People figured he was bitter. They were wrong. Everett was just done wasting time on men who wouldn't listen. So when that chemical smell rolled into the co-op picnic and someone finally spotted the smoke, there was confusion first, then the kind of slow-motion panic that happens when nobody's quite sure who's in charge. The volunteer fire company had one truck, a 1965 International pumper, that the county maintained about as well as they maintained the roads, which is to say, barely. The fire chief, a real estate man named Dwayne Garrett who'd taken the position because it looked good on his campaign literature when he ran for county commissioner, started barking orders, but half his crew was already 3 beers deep into the picnic, and the other half couldn't find the keys to the truck for the first 5 minutes. By the time they got rolling, the smoke had grown into a boiling column that everyone could see, dark orange light pulsing underneath it like a fall sunrise, and the wind was still blowing steady, pushing whatever was burning right toward the dry grassland between the old Kemper place and the town limits. Now, before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a chemical fire in person, not on television, but standing there in the real world where the heat hits your face like a physical thing, and the smoke makes your eyes water even from a quarter mile off? If you have, you know. If you haven't, count yourself lucky, because what was burning out there wasn't just wood or grass or even gasoline. Those drums the Chicago outfit had stored. Nobody had checked them proper. Nobody had asked what permits were filed. Nobody had walked the site to see if they were stored right or if any had started leaking in the Kansas heat. Turned out they were industrial solvents, the kind of thing that burns hot and fast and doesn't care about water or dirt or prayers. And when one drum went up, probably from spontaneous combustion in the heat or maybe a spark from something, nobody ever got a straight answer. It took the others with it, and suddenly there was a fire burning at 1,200 degrees, tearing across drought-dead grass with the wind behind it like a demon. Now, before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever seen a chemical fire in person, not on television, but standing there in the real world where the heat hits your face like a physical thing and the smoke makes your eyes water even from a quarter mile off? If you have, you know. If you haven't, count yourself lucky, because what was burning out there wasn't just wood or grass or even gasoline. Those drums the Chicago outfit had stored. Nobody had checked them proper. Nobody had asked what permits were filed. Nobody had walked the site to see if they were stored right or if any had started leaking in the Kansas heat. Turned out they were industrial solvents, the kind of thing that burns hot and fast and doesn't care about water or dirt or prayers. And when one drum went up, probably from spontaneous combustion in the heat or maybe a spark from something, nobody ever got a straight answer. It took the others with it. And suddenly there was a fire burning at 1,200 degrees, tearing across drought-dead grass with the wind behind it like a demon. The volunteer company got there first, rolled up in the pumper with lights flashing, and Dwayne Garrett stood on the running board, surveying the situation like a general at Gettysburg. Except Dwayne had never fought a fire like this. Hell, nobody in Collier Springs had. The biggest emergency they dealt with in 5 years was when lightning hit the Methodist church steeple, and they'd put it out with garden hoses before the truck even arrived. This was different. This was a wall of flame 30 feet high in places, moving faster than a man could run, feeding on itself, and the pumper truck had maybe 500 gallons of water, which was like spitting at a hurricane. They tried anyway, drove in as close as they dared, unrolled the hoses, and opened up, but the water evaporated before it hit the ground, and the heat drove them back within 2 minutes. That's when Dwayne made his first big mistake. He radioed for help from Harper County, the next county over, because they had a bigger truck and more men. Problem was, Harper County was 40 minutes away on a good day, and this wasn't a good day. Back in town, people were starting to realize how bad this could get. The wind wasn't letting up. The fire was already across the old county road, heading northeast, and if it kept on that track, it would hit the Sanderson Ranch first, 400 acres of dry wheat stubble that would light up like gunpowder, and then it would be in the grassland corridor that ran right to the edge of Collier Springs. There were houses out there, farms, families, and between the fire and the town, there was basically nothing but fuel. Someone said they should start evacuating. Someone else said evacuate to where, and with what vehicles, since half the town was standing in the co-op parking lot watching the smoke. Then someone, I think it was Eddie Parsons who ran the hardware store, said what everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to say out loud. They needed to cut a fire break, and they needed to do it now. And they needed every machine they could get. That's when things got interesting. Because cutting a fire break in dry earth with grass fire coming at you isn't like plowing a field on a sunny afternoon. You need width, at least 20 feet, preferably more. You need it fast. And you need equipment that won't quit on you when the smoke gets thick and the heat starts warping metal, and your lungs are full of ash. The town had maybe 6 tractors they could round up quick, newer machines belonging to the bigger operators, the ones who'd be willing to risk their equipment in an emergency. They started making calls. knocking on doors, and within 20 minutes they had 4 rigs assembled at the edge of town where the grassland started. A new John Deere 4020, 2 Internationals, and a Massey Ferguson that belonged to a farmer from the next township who'd heard about it on his CB radio and drove over. They lined up, drivers revving their engines, waiting for Dwayne to tell them where to start cutting. And that's when the John Deere 4020 seized up. Just quit, threw a rod or busted a hydraulic line. Nobody was sure, but it was done. And suddenly they were down to 3 machines trying to plow a fire break that needed to be 2 miles long. 3 machines weren't going to do it. Everyone knew it, but nobody wanted to say it, because saying it meant admitting they were about to lose homes, maybe lives. And there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. Then someone mentioned Everett. I think it was Eddie's wife, Clara, who said it first, half to herself, standing there in the parking lot with her hands twisted in her apron, watching the smoke. She said, "What about Everett Walsh? He's got that old tractor." And the men heard her, and there was this moment, this pause, where you could see them all thinking the same thing. That old piece of junk? That museum piece? But they were desperate, and desperate men will try anything. So Dwayne got on the radio and raised someone who knew where Everett lived, and they sent a truck out to his place. And when they got there and told him what was happening, Everett just nodded once, walked into his barn, and fired up the Model A. Now I want you to picture this. It's full dark by now, maybe 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night, and the fire is a living thing on the horizon, painting the sky orange and red like the end of the world. The wind is still blowing, hot and constant, carrying embers that start new spot fires wherever they land. The air tastes like metal and smoke. And into this scene comes Everett Walsh, driving his 1948 John Deere model down the county road at 12 miles per hour, that old 2-cylinder engine popping away with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. No cab, no roll bar, just a man on a metal seat with his hand on the throttle, and a plow rig hooked up behind him that he'd welded together himself from scrap iron and determination. When he pulled up to where the other tractors were waiting, people stared. Some of them actually laughed. Nervous laughter. The kind that comes when you're scared and don't know what else to do. Someone said, "You gotta be kidding." And someone else said, "That thing will quit in 10 minutes. And Dwayne Garrett looked at Everett like he was trying to decide if this was help or a distraction. Everett didn't say anything. He just drove past them, out into the grassland, and started plowing. And here's what those other farmers, those men with their modern machines and their bank loans and their hydraulics, didn't understand until they saw it happen. That old Model A was built different. It was built for a time when tractors had to last, when a farmer couldn't just call a dealer and order parts, when reliability mattered more than speed. The 2-cylinder engine was simple, almost primitive, but was damn near indestructible if you maintained it right. No complicated fuel injection, no electronics, no computers, nothing that could fail when the smoke got thick. Just compression and spark and fuel, over and over, steady as the sunrise. And Everett had rebuilt that machine so many times he could fix anything that broke with a wrench and some wire. The other tractors were faster, sure, more powerful, but power doesn't mean much if your engine chokes on ash and dies. They worked through the night, all 5 of them now, cutting parallel lines through grassland, trying to create a gap wide enough that the fire couldn't jump it. The smoke was so thick you could barely see 20 feet, and the heat was intense even from 100 yards away, and every few minutes the wind would shift and someone would have to back up fast because embers were landing on their tires. 2 hours in, one of the Internationals blew a hydraulic seal and had to drop out. Half an hour after that, the Massey Ferguson overheated, and the driver had to shut it down before the engine seized. That left the 1 International in Everett, and they kept going back and forth, cutting that fire break foot by foot, and the whole time the fire kept coming relentless, eating grass and brush and fence posts and anything else that would burn. And the Model A kept running. Not fast, not fancy, just steady. Put, put, put. That old engine beating away in the darkness. Everett hunched over the wheel with his face covered in ash and his eyes streaming from the smoke. And behind him the plow dug into the hard Kansas earth and turned it over, black soil against dry grass, a line of defense that grew longer and longer as the hours passed. The men back in town, the ones who weren't driving tractors, had organized themselves into a bucket brigade at the edge of the fire break, weighing down anything that looked like it might catch, and they watched Everett work, and the laughter from earlier was gone now, replaced by something else, something like respect, or maybe shame, or maybe just a realization that they've been wrong about him, about that tractor, about what mattered when the chips were down. Around 2 in the morning, the Harper County fire truck finally showed up, along with trucks from 2 other counties who'd heard the call and come to help, and they hit the fire from the flanks while Everett and the last International finished the fire break. By 3:30, they had a line cut from the county road all the way to the creek bed on the north side, a 20-foot gap of bare earth that the fire would have to cross if it wanted to reach town, and when the flames finally got there, they hit that gap and hesitated, losing momentum, and the firefighters were able to knock down the edges with water and foam and keep it from jumping. By sunrise, the fire was contained. 60 acres burned, including most of the old Kemper place, but nothing else. No homes, no barns, no livestock. The town was safe. Everett drove his Model A back to his farm as the sun came up, that same slow 12 miles per hour, that same steady popping rhythm. And people lined the road to watch him pass. Nobody said much. A few men nodded. A few women waved. Everett didn't acknowledge any of it, just kept his eyes on the road and his hand on the throttle. And when he got home, he parked the tractor in the barn, checked the oil, wiped down the engine, and went inside to sleep. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because this isn't one of those tales where everyone learns their lesson and lives happily ever after. The town did appreciate what Everett had done, in their way. Dwayne Garrett made a speech at the next county meeting about community cooperation and resilience, and he mentioned Everett by name, which was something. The newspaper ran a story with a picture of the Model A parked beside the firebreak, and people clipped it out and stuck it on their refrigerators. For a few weeks, when Everett came into town, folks would buy him coffee and shake his hand and tell him he'd done good. But here's the thing about small towns. Memory is short and habits are long. By autumn, the jokes started up again. Not mean, like I said before, just that comfortable ribbing that people fall back into because it's familiar. Someone at the feed store would see Everett and say, "Hey, heard your antiques saved the town," with a grin that was supposed to be friendly but carried that edge of condescension, that suggestion that it was a fluke, a lucky break, not something you could count on. And the younger farmers went back to talking about horsepower and financing and the latest models, and Everett's Model A was back to being a curiosity, a relic, something from the past that didn't belong in the modern world. But some things had changed, even if people didn't always show it. Eddie Parsons, the hardware store owner, started keeping a better stock of older tractor parts, the kind of thing that would fit a Model A or a Farmel or any of the vintage machines that a few old-timers still ran. He never made a big deal about it, just quietly expanded his inventory, and when Everett came in looking for a gasket or bearing, Eddie had it or could get it fast. And Clara Parsons, who'd been the first to suggest calling Everett that night, she made a point of speaking to him at church, asking after his farm, treating him like someone whose opinion mattered. There were a few others, too, people who'd seen him work that night and understood what it meant. That reliability wasn't just about having the newest equipment, that sometimes the old ways, the proven ways, were worth holding on to. There was one more thing, something that didn't come out until later, that I think you should know about. Turned out the fire hadn't been quite the accident everyone assumed. State inspectors came through a few weeks after, looking at the burn site, checking what was left of those storage drums, and they found evidence that at least 3 of them had been leaking for months, puddling solvent onto ground in violation of about 15 different regulations. The Chicago outfit that owned them had known, or should have known, and they'd done nothing. Worse, the county commissioners, including Dwayne Garrett, had apparently signed off on the storage permit without doing a site inspection because the company had greased the wheels with some campaign contributions and promises of jobs that never materialized. So that fire that nearly burned down Collier Springs, was an act of God or bad luck. It was negligence, plain and simple, the kind of thing that happens when people care more about money and politics than doing their jobs right. When that news got around, there was some anger, some talk of lawsuits or recalls, but nothing came of it. This was 1971, and things worked different then. The company paid a fine. The state made some new rules about chemical storage, and Dwayne Garrett got quietly pushed out of his position as fire chief, though he stayed on as county commissioner for another term before he moved to Topeka to sell insurance. And life went on the way it does in small towns, where scandals fade and grudges simmer, and people just keep working, because there's always another season coming, and crops don't care about politics. Everett kept farming his 220 acres, and he kept running that Model A, and over the years the jokes got a little less frequent and a little less sharp. By the time I left Sumner County in the mid-'80s, Everett was in his 60s and still going strong, and that tractor was still running, and if you drove past his place on a spring morning, you could hear it out in the fields, that steady pop, 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 carrying across the flat land like a heartbeat, like the sound of something that refuses to quit. And maybe that's the real point of all this, the thing worth remembering, because it's easy to laugh at someone who does things different, who holds on to the old ways when everyone else is chasing the new. It's easy to assume that newer means better, that progress is always forward, that the past doesn't have anything to teach us. But when the fire comes, and the fire always comes in one form or another, you find out real quick what's worth keeping and what's just flash. You find out who shows up and who talks big but can't deliver. You find out that sometimes the thing everyone's been laughing at is the thing that saves you. Now, I'm curious what you think about all this. If you've been in Collier Springs at night, watching the smoke roll in and the fire come toward town, would you have trusted that old Model A to make a difference? Would you have laughed when Everett showed up? Or would you have seen what he was bringing to the table? And what about those commissioners who let that chemical company cut corners? Have you ever seen something similar in your own town, where money talks louder than common sense and people pay the price later? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely like to know how this story lands with folks who've lived through their own versions of it. There's something else worth considering here about the nature community and how we decide who's valuable and who's not. Everett Walsh could have stayed home that night. He had every reason to. The town had been laughing at him for years, treating his choices like a joke, and he owed them nothing. He'd even quit the volunteer fire company because they wouldn't listen to him. But when the call came, he didn't hesitate. He fired up that old tractor and went to work, not because he wanted recognition or thanks, but because it was the right thing to do, because people's homes were at risk, because that's what you did if you had the tools and the knowledge and the guts. And that says something about character that I think gets lost sometimes in all our modern talk about success and status. Everett wasn't rich. He wasn't connected. He didn't have the newest equipment or the biggest spread. What he had was skill and reliability, and a sense of duty that went deeper than personal pride. And when it mattered, that was enough. The years after the fire weren't easy ones for farming in Sumner County. The drought that set up the conditions for that chemical fire stuck around for another 2 seasons. And a lot of the younger farmers, the ones with the big loans and the fancy equipment, found themselves underwater when the banks came calling. Some of them sold out. Some of them hung on by their fingernails, taking second jobs in town or leasing out their land. The ones who made it through were usually the ones who kept their overhead low, who'd maintained their equipment themselves, who'd learned to get by on less because they'd never had the option of getting by on more. Farmers like Everett, in other words. And I wonder sometimes if that fire taught people something about that, about the difference between looking successful and actually being resilient. But I could be giving folks too much credit. People believe what they want to believe, and most of the time what they want to believe is that they're doing everything right, and anyone who's different is just stubborn or backward or unlucky. One last thing before we wrap up here, and then I want to hear from you. About 5 years after the fire, in 1976, there was a county fair in Collier Springs, the big summer event that everyone looked forward to, with livestock shows and pie contests, and a tractor pull that drew people from 3 counties over. Everett entered the antique tractor division with his Model A, not because he thought he'd win anything, but because the entry fee went to volunteer fire department, and he figured he'd support that. There were maybe a dozen tractors in the antique class, all of them restored beauties, paint gleaming, chrome polished, owned by collectors who hauled them around on trailers and showed them off like fine art. And then there was Everett's Model A, dusty and work-worn, with dings in the sheet metal and grease stains on the engine, because it was a working tractor, not a showpiece. The judges walked around, taking notes, and when they got to Everett's rig, one of them asked him how original it was, like he was expecting to hear about original parts and factory specifications. And Everett said, "Nothing on it's original anymore. I've replaced every part at least once." but it's still the same tractor my grandfather bought in 1948. And the judge didn't know what to do with that, because it was true, but it complicated the whole idea of what made something authentic. Was it authentic because the parts were original, or because it had been continuously used for the same purpose by the same family for nearly 30 years? They didn't give Everett a ribbon that day, but someone took a picture of him standing next to the Model A with his arms crossed, and that picture ended up in the County Historical Society a few years later, with a little placard explaining about the fire and how that old tractor had helped save the town. And I think that's a kind of recognition that matters more than ribbons, because it's the kind that lasts, that becomes part of the story a place tells about itself. It says, this is who we were at our best. This is what we did when it counted. This is the kind of person we want to remember. So let me ask you one more time, because I'm genuinely interested. What's your take on this whole thing? Are you someone who believes in holding on to the old ways, the proven tools, the things that have stood the test of time? Or do you think there's value in always chasing the new, always upgrading, always looking for the next best thing? And have you ever been in a situation where something everyone dismissed or laughed at turned out to be exactly what you needed? I bet a lot of you watching this have your own versions of the story, your own Everett Walsh who came through when nobody expected it. Share those stories in the comments. I read every one, and I guarantee other folks watching will appreciate hearing them too. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel is all about these kinds of stories: rural history, farm life, small town drama, the kind of true-to-life tales from America's farming communities that don't make it into the history books but deserve to be remembered. We post new stories every week, different people, different places, but always the same core values of hard work, community, and the land. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of them, and ring the bell if you want notifications when new videos drop. And if you've got a story you think I should cover, or a topic you want to hear about, drop that in the comments too. This channel works best when it's a conversation, not a lecture. Now, Everett Walsh passed away in 1994. His farm got sold to a corporate operation that folded it into a bigger spread and tore down most of the buildings. But that Model A, that 1948 John Deere that everyone laughed at and then relied on when it mattered most, that tractor is still around. Everett's grandson has it, keeps it in a barn in Oklahoma, fires it up a few times a year, and takes it to shows. Still runs, still sounds the same, still turns heads. And every time someone asks about it, the grandson tells a story about the night it helped save Collier Springs from burning to the ground, about how everyone thought it was a joke until the fire came and they learned different. And maybe that's the best legacy a man or a machine can have. Not that you were the biggest or the fanciest or the newest, but that when people needed you most, you showed up and did the work. That's worth more than any ribbon or trophy or newspaper article. That's the kind of thing that echoes through generations. That becomes part of the bedrock of who we are and where we come from. So here's to the Everett Walshes of the world, the ones who keep the old machines running and the old ways alive, not out of stubbornness, but out of understanding. Here's to the people who show up when the fire comes, who do the work without expecting thanks, who prove their worth not with words but with action. And here's to you for taking the time to listen to this story and carry it forward. Because that's how these things survive, not in museums or history books, but in the memories of people who hear them and recognize the truth in them and pass them along to the next generation. That's how we honor the past and build the future at the same time. That's how we make sure that the lessons learned in the smoke and fire and fear don't get lost when things go back to normal and everyone forgets what it felt like to be scared. All right, I've kept you long enough. Drop those comments, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of your tools, take care of your land, and take care of each other, because you never know when you're going to need them all.